So, my first introduction into the world of production was 2008. I was a senior at Woodstock High School, and in order for us to graduate, we needed to have a senior project, which most of the time was an internship. And so at the time, I had a friend, Adrena, her dad, worked at the Gospel Music Channel, and he was able to get me an internship. The Gospel Music Channel, which I don't really know if it's still around or not, but it basically was like the MTV for gospel music. So I got to meet some incredible people, really just some incredible and inspiring people, and not just like the famous gospel singers, but like some people in production as well. And just throughout that, throughout my journey of being in the production world and just being in the business world, I've gotten to meet some really incredible people. And it's when I met those people, the ones that were willing to share their knowledge or their experiences with me, I felt like when I walked away from that conversation, a piece of my life was transformed. I felt like I had gone through a mini masterclass, even if it was just a 10-minute conversation. And so that feeling that I had with like, man, that person is just so wise, or that person is just so knowledgeable, or they're just so smart, or man, they made me feel like I could go out and do anything I wanted to do. Lean in a little bit, because that is exactly how people feel about you. I want to make sure you heard me. That exact feeling that I just said is exactly how people feel about you. You're inspiring, motivational, a wealth of knowledge, have expertise in something specific. You've built a successful business. You've helped lead a successful company. And each time you speak to somebody, they walk away feeling transformed, inspired, motivated. And that's exactly how people feel after they've had a conversation with you. So today, we're going to break down how a podcast can leverage your experience and knowledge to position yourself as an authority, but even better, elevate your brand. So stay tuned for this week's episode of the Kannon Studios Podcast. Okay, can we all agree for a moment there that we feel like there's an influx of podcasts where people are sharing their thought leadership on a specific area? And by thought leadership can be something negative or positive, but they are sharing their thought leadership and their maybe quote unquote expertise on something, even if we don't agree with it. And so I know for 2023 and kind of the tail end of 2022, there seemed like this huge influx of relationship podcasts. And some of them are just bad. Some of them are cool and good, but some of them are bad. And so people are listening to that information, though. They're listening to that information and they're taking value away from that. So just think about how much more powerful it would be if you were on a podcast sharing the experiences and the knowledge and the actual true thought leadership on your expertise in your specific industry that you could share with people. Think about how much more powerful and how much more of a light you would bring to the world of podcasting and to people's lives. So today we're going to go over how a podcast can really elevate your brand and position you as a thought leader or an authority. Number one, use your podcast as a thought leadership platform. So kind of what we were just talking about, right? Podcasting allows you to show your expertise and insight into your zone of genius, right? That's the key word, your zone of genius, your area of expertise, because there's a lot of people that are out here saying they're experts in something and they're not. They're duplicating information that they've heard from someone else without actually implementing that information, or they may have implemented that information but haven't been in it long enough to actually make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and then correct. So we really have, like, in the podcasting world, or just in the business world in general, we have a lot of copy paste. And so what if you could be that true thought leader that is providing actual, real, valuable insight? So a podcast allows you to dive deep into topics while offering your unique and proven perspective, especially since you're the expert. You have years of experience doing this, right? Maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, right? And so that is going to provide some insight that the next person, even if they've been in the same industry as you, you're going to have completely different experiences. So you're able to talk through those experiences. You're able to teach people about those experiences, which is going to elevate your brain and position you as somebody as the go-to within your industry. So identify one key area of your expertise and intersect that with the problems that your listeners have to create a solution that's available through your podcast. So your podcast should ultimately be the solution for whatever information or problem that your listener has. And that right there is only going to happen if you identify who you're specifically talking to, which is what we talked about in the episode titled "How to Start Your Podcast in 2024." If you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to it. But you need to identify what is your key area of expertise and intersect that with the problems that the listener has, and position your podcast as the solution to that problem, which then elevates your brand and positions you as a thought leader and an authority. When I say authority, I don't mean like standing over somebody, like, not that. I view an authority as somebody that you can learn from. You can be somebody's online digital mentor through a podcast, right? That's what I mean by an authority. Somebody that is willing to teach based on their experiences, right? So as you're going through this and you're trying to figure out, like, how can I create or position myself as a thought leader using a podcast? So think about this for a second. Who is the go-to person in your industry? And who is the go-to person in your industry for content or podcasting content? So if you're a real estate agent, or you're a mortgage loan officer, or you're an insurance agent, when you want to find out more information about something very specific, who is it that you go to? Do they have a podcast? Do they have consistent video content? If not, that's an opportunity for you. But at the same time, the way that you think about that person, that is what you want to become for somebody else. So for me personally, when I think about the go-to person in my industry for content, specifically podcasting content, I think about David Shands. David Shands is somebody that has been in the content game for a minute. And I actually was I knew about David Shands probably 8 or 9 years ago before he was even in the game of podcasting, but I knew that he always provided something valuable. Before he became like this podcast guru, he always provided something valuable. And so just through the years, I followed him. And one thing that I can say about David is his content is focused around successful entrepreneurs and different topics within that. But one thing that I always go to David for when I'm feeling in a rut, or if I want to just learn this specific skill, is David Shands has mastered the art of interviewing guests, not like a job interview, interviewing guests. That is what David has mastered. And when I am trying to figure out how I should approach a guest, maybe it's a guest that I've never met before, maybe it's someone that I'm speaking to that I've never met before, whatever the case may be, how do I master the art of interviewing, and how do I stay curious about that person and let them be the spotlight and the highlight of the conversation and take it off of me? So that's what I mean by who is the go-to in your industry for something very specific. So for me, it's David Shands, and specifically around the art of interviewing. All right, so that's number one, using your podcast as a thought leadership platform. Number two, building a personal connection with your audience. Once again, this goes back to that step, identifying who you're speaking to, right? Who is this podcast for? So building a personal connection with your audience. This is where you want to get vulnerable. When you decide to become a podcaster, there has to be a level of vulnerability to build connection with your audience. So if you listen to the episode before this, I talked about how I built up this podcast and then I stopped for multiple reasons. Personal things, things in business, right? So that's me being vulnerable. Really, I stopped this podcast because I was filled with excuses. I'm too busy. I don't have time. I have too many clients. I need to service my clients, so I can't really work on the pod. I mean, just any excuse you can think of. That was the reason why I didn't finish out and wasn't consistent with this podcast. And the way that I was able to get a little bit vulnerable with you is the same thing you're going to have to do with your audience, right? But that level of vulnerability has to be spoken on a level that's relevant to them. Right? So the only way you know if it's relevant to them is if you get inside the mind of the person that you're speaking to. So you really have to take some time to do that. Utilize a personal story or experience in each episode to connect with listeners. So over the last, 2-3 months, there's been significant changes in terms of life personally. One of those big changes has been that Kannon is now being homeschooled. And so that adds on another responsibility between me and Kyle. And so if you're looking at that for me, that's an excuse for me not to be consistent with content. But I'm not letting it be. Right? Using that as an excuse gives me permission to give you an excuse when you say you don't have time, right? So me understanding that everybody's calendar is busy is still not an excuse for you not to create content consistently, right? And so utilizing personal story or experience in each episode gives you the ability to connect with listeners. So just think about a story that you have that's relevant to whatever your topic is. Number 3, share stories that you're already familiar with. Reflect on your years of expertise and utilize those to show vulnerability while also providing value through the lesson provided in the story. So, since you've been doing this for a while, you have some stories. Now, I'm not saying share every single story, and I'm not saying you have to share every single detail of the story. But the stories that are okay to share those stories, because that's only going to help build that connection with people, right? They're going to be able to relate. And another thing is, if you utilize a story, especially a story that's relevant to whatever the topic is and also relevant to the person you're speaking to, they may not remember anything else that you said in that podcast episode, but they will remember that story. I guarantee they will remember that story, especially if you're able to craft it in a way that's aimed at them, right? That's relevant to them. Because I'm pretty sure though your story and their story may be different, there is some alignment and some crossover in between the two stories. So they will remember that story. So don't be afraid to share those stories in your podcast. That helps you build that personal connection with your audience. And then number 3, leverage a podcast for networking and collaboration. So podcasting opens up numerous opportunities for networking and collaboration and that happens by inviting guests from various fields. Now, you still have to do this strategically Because one of the things that I also did when we launched Kannon Studios was I just invited whoever on the podcast. Now, all the guests we had were absolutely incredible. But the list that I had was probably of 100 people. And literally what I did was I went through my phone and said, do they own a business? Yep. Okay, put them on the list. Right, which you may start out doing that, but now thinking back on it, you have to still be a little bit strategic and say, okay, how does this make sense? Like, why do I need to have this veterinarian on my podcast? What can I speak to them about? Are they active in the community? Do people know them, right? Like, how can this benefit the both of us? Ultimately, how can we create an episode together that is going to be able to allow us to provide value to the person that's listening? So you have to think through those things when you're thinking about leveraging your podcast as a way for collaboration with another business owner or another thought leader, right? Like, how does this make sense for you to be a part of this podcast and for me to be able to let you have access to my listeners, right? So those are the three main big things, right? Today we talked about today we broke down how to leverage a podcast to position you as a thought leader, an authority, and how to elevate your overall brand. So it was using your podcast as a thought leadership platform, building a personal connection with your audience, and then leveraging your podcast for networking and collaboration. We covered all three of those things. And you are probably more of an expert than you realize. And people are waiting to hear from you. They're waiting to hear what you have to say. But you're downplaying yourself because you don't think that you have enough experiences. But the truth is you do. And there's a connection point somewhere that is hidden inside of your brain. You just have to get it out and think through it and do that in the form of a podcast. This is the easiest way to do it. It's just sitting and talking into a microphone, right? There's not an audience here to tell you if what you're saying is true or not. Nobody can see your facial expressions until this is published out, right? And so people are waiting on what it is that you have today to say. Sometimes we play the comparison game and downplay just how good we are. Let's stop doing that this year and start sharing the knowledge that you actually have as a successful business owner and a successful business leader. There's someone waiting for you on the other side of your fear. And that person could be you. It's a bunch of other people, but the main person that could be waiting on the other side of fear of starting a podcast and committing and being vulnerable and committing the time and committing and investing money or whatever that case may be, the other person on that side of all those pieces of fear that's waiting for you to share this information and get it out is probably you. So just think about that. I know all this information may be overwhelming, and if you're just now listening, you're probably like, what in the world? How do I even get started with a podcast? I don't know where to start. I don't know, what do I need to do to even plan to begin this? Don't worry about it. I got you. I got a free guide. It's a 25-minute launch your podcast blueprint. So, and about the length of this episode, maybe even this episode, about the length of this episode, you'll be able to be ready to launch your podcast. I have that free resource available for you to download. It's a 25-minute launch your podcast blueprint. It's available for free. You download it. I'll put that link in the show notes below. Yeah. That's it for today. Just if you don't listen to anything else, there is someone waiting for you on the other side of your fear of launching a podcast or sharing your knowledge with the world. And that other person may be yourself. Just think about that. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening or watching this from. We appreciate you. And as always, keep creating. This is the Kannon Studios Podcast.